the millionaire disguised herself as a waitress and applied for a job in her own restaurant. The way she was treated left her in tears of amazement. Isabella Hargrove had always been accustomed to the luxury that came with her last name. She was the heiress of Hargrove Enterprises, a renowned chain of restaurants scattered across the United States. From a young age, she'd been surrounded by the best things money could buy: lavish parties, designer clothes, exotic vacations. But despite the privilege, there was always a part of her that felt disconnected, as if she was standing outside her own life, looking in. Her father had built the business from scratch, and after he passed away, Isabella was determined to keep his legacy alive. Yet, lately, troubling reports had been reaching her desk. Complaints about mismanagement, mistreatment of staff, and even whispers of financial discrepancies. Her intuition told her something was wrong, and she knew she couldn't keep running the business from behind a desk. She needed to see it for herself. That was how she ended up in Charleston, South Carolina, dressed in a simple uniform, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, and a name tag that read Emily. It felt surreal walking into one of her own restaurants as someone else entirely. She could sense the questioning looks from the staff as she stepped inside, but no one said a word. For all they knew, she was just another new hire, here to pick up a few extra shifts. The restaurant had a certain charm from the outside, with its red brick facade and flower boxes hanging under the windows. But the moment Isabella walked through the door, she was hit with a wave of tension. The air felt thick, as if the place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She glanced around, noting the worn-out faces of the staff, the hurried steps, and the silence that lingered longer than it should have. Isabella's heart tightened. This wasn't how her father's restaurants were supposed to feel. They were supposed to be places filled with warmth, laughter, and the aroma of good food. She remembered how he used to say, "A restaurant is like a home, and every customer should feel like a welcome guest." But there was no sign of that here. She didn't have long to dwell on it before a tall, stern-looking man approached her. "You must be the new girl," he said, barely glancing at her. "I'm Martin, the manager. Don't expect any special treatment just because you're new. Around here, everyone pulls their weight, and I don't tolerate slackers." "Understood," Isabella replied, keeping her voice steady. She could already sense his authoritative demeanor, the way he carried himself as if he owned the place, even though he didn't. She'd read his file before coming. Martin Kavanaugh, efficient, but known to be strict. Too strict, some might say. It was clear why people had been complaining, but she needed to see it firsthand. "Good. Now grab a tray and get to work," he ordered. "There's no time for standing around." Isabella nodded and headed to the back, where she found the other waitstaff getting ready for the evening rush. She noticed how they moved quietly, almost as if they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. It was unsettling. She picked up a tray and started to shadow one of the other waitresses, a woman named Karen who had been there for years. "Stick with me, and I'll show you the ropes," Karen said, her voice kind but tired. "It can get pretty hectic, but you'll get used to it." Isabella smiled gratefully. "Thanks. I'm Emily, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Emily. Let's hope you last longer than the last one," Karen said, with a hint of sadness in her tone. Isabella didn't have to ask what she meant. She could guess that turnover was high here. It was another red flag that something was deeply wrong. As they moved around the restaurant, Isabella took in everything. The hurried exchanges between the kitchen and the waitstaff, the strained smiles on the faces of servers as they dealt with demanding customers, and most notably, the way Martin's eyes seemed to follow every movement, looking for the slightest mistake. He barked orders, never once offering a kind word or a moment of encouragement. It was like he thrived on keeping everyone on edge. By the end of her shift, Isabella felt drained, both physically and emotionally. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but seeing it all up close was much harder than she had imagined. It was clear that Martin ran the place with an iron fist, and no one dared to question him. But as tired as she was, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had to dig deeper, find out how things had gotten so bad, and most importantly, she had to do something about it. As she clocked out, she overheard a conversation that caught her attention. Two of the kitchen staff were whispering near the back entrance, their voices low but urgent. "Did you hear what happened to Caleb again? Martin's got it out for him, I swear. He just won't let up, will he? That guy does more work than anyone here. And still, he's the one who gets all the crap." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. Caleb. She remembered the name from the reports, one of the waiters who had been mentioned more than once for his hard work and pleasant demeanor. She hadn't met him yet, but she made a mental note to keep an eye out. If Martin was targeting him, she needed to know why. As she left the restaurant that evening, the sky was painted with hues of orange and purple, the sun setting over the Charleston streets. Isabella took a deep breath, letting the cool air clear her mind. She had only just begun her journey, but she was already starting to understand that uncovering the truth would be more complicated than she had thought. There were layers to peel back, secrets buried beneath the surface, and she was determined to uncover every single one of them. Isabella's second day at the restaurant started with the same tension she had felt the day before. She walked through the door, and for a moment, it seemed as though everything was normal. The restaurant was waking up for the day, the kitchen was bustling, and waitstaff were getting ready for the breakfast rush. But as she looked around, she could see the subtle signs of stress in the way people moved, hurried, quiet, avoiding eye contact. Martin was already in his usual spot, standing by the counter with a clipboard, barking orders to anyone within earshot. He barely acknowledged Isabella's presence as she slipped past him, but she didn't mind. It allowed her to move freely, observing everything without drawing too much attention. She made her way to the back, where she spotted Karen preparing the coffee station. "Morning, Karen," Isabella said, trying to sound cheerful despite the heavy atmosphere. "Need any help?" Karen glanced up, a little surprised to see her there so early. "Morning, Emily. Sure, you can start refilling the sugar packets. We'll need plenty for the breakfast crowd." As Isabella got to work, she noticed a young man with sandy brown hair and a kind smile helping another waitress with a tray. She immediately knew who he was, Caleb Bennett. Even from a distance, there was something calming about his presence. He moved with ease, his voice soft and reassuring as he spoke to his colleague. And unlike many of the others, he didn't seem weighed down by the stress around him. Isabella found herself curious. What kind of person could remain kind and patient under such conditions? She wanted to know more about him, and what it was about him that seemed to draw Martin's ire. As the breakfast rush began, Isabella and the other staff hustled to keep up. Customers filled the booths, and the kitchen buzzed with activity. She tried to keep her head down and do her job, but it was impossible not to notice how Caleb seemed to be everywhere at once, helping whoever needed it. When a tray almost toppled over, he caught it just in time. When a customer complained about a missing order, he rushed to make sure it was corrected. He was like a quiet, efficient whirlwind, and yet no one seemed to thank him for it. At one point, Isabella found herself working beside him at the coffee station. "Hey, I'm Emily," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. "I'm new here." Caleb smiled, a little distracted as he poured coffee into a cup. "Nice to meet you, Emily. I'm Caleb. Welcome to the madness." She laughed, appreciating his sense of humor. "It definitely feels like madness, but you seem to handle it pretty well." "Yeah, well, you get used to it after a while," he said, his smile fading slightly. "It's not always easy, but someone's got to do it." There was a hint of something in his voice. Resignation, maybe, or just exhaustion. Isabella wanted to ask more, but before she could, Martin's voice cut through the room. "Caleb, stop chatting and get back to work. I don't pay you to stand around." Caleb's expression didn't change, but Isabella could see a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Yes, sir," he said simply, before giving her a quick nod and moving on to his next task. As the morning wore on, Isabella continued to observe. She noticed how Martin seemed to single out certain employees, always the same ones, always with the same harsh tone. He barely spoke to the others, but when it came to Caleb, Karen, and a few others, he was relentless. It was as if he was waiting for them to make a mistake, just so he could pounce. During her break, Isabella sat outside on the back steps, trying to make sense of everything she'd seen. She had hoped that things might be better than the reports had suggested, but it was clear that wasn't the case. Martin was creating a toxic environment, and the staff was suffering because of it. She was still lost in thought when the door creaked open, and Caleb stepped out, carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee. He hesitated when he saw her, then smiled. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," Isabella said, surprised but grateful for the company. He handed her one of the cups and sat down beside her. "It's not much, but it's better than the stuff we serve inside," he said with a chuckle. Isabella took a sip and nodded. "Thanks. I needed this." There was a moment of silence before she decided to take a chance. "So, is it always like this around here?" Caleb glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Pretty much. Martin's been running things this way for as long as I've been here. It's tough, but you just learn to deal with it. Some days are better than others." Isabella hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "And no one's ever tried to, I don't know, talk to him about it?" Caleb laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, people have tried. It never ends well. Martin's got connections, and he knows how to cover his tracks. The best thing you can do is keep your head down and hope he doesn't notice you." Isabella's heart sank. This was worse than she thought. She could see the weariness in Caleb's eyes, the kind that came from fighting a losing battle for too long. It made her even more determined to do something, but she knew she had to be careful. If Martin caught wind of her true identity, everything would be over before she even had a chance to start. As their break came to an end, Caleb stood up and offered her a hand. "Come on, let's get back to it. We've still got a few hours to survive." Isabella took his hand and let him pull her up. "Thanks, Caleb," she said, her voice sincere. "For the coffee and, for talking." He gave her a warm smile. "Anytime, Emily." As they walked back inside, Isabella couldn't help but feel a growing sense of resolve. She had come here to find out the truth, and now she had. But knowing wasn't enough. She had to act. And for that, she needed more information. She needed to understand exactly how deep the problem went, and she needed allies. And if there was one thing she was certain of, it was that Caleb could be one of those allies. But first, she had to earn his trust. The next few days were a blur of rushed shifts, endless orders, and tense encounters with Martin. Isabella quickly realized that being a waitress was far more challenging than she had anticipated. She had always respected the staff who worked at her restaurants, but experiencing it firsthand gave her a whole new perspective. There were so many things to juggle: keeping track of orders, handling difficult customers, and moving quickly without dropping anything. But it wasn't just the work that made it hard. It was the atmosphere. The restaurant felt like it was on the verge of breaking, with Martin's presence looming over everyone like a dark cloud. His eyes were everywhere, and Isabella could feel them on her whenever she made the slightest mistake. He never missed an opportunity to point it out, making sure she and everyone else knew when they weren't meeting his standards. "Emily, that's the second time you've dropped a glass this week," he snapped one afternoon as the shards scattered across the floor. "Get it together, or you're out." "I'm sorry," Isabella said, quickly bending down to pick up the pieces. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she felt the eyes of the other staff on her. She wasn't used to being talked to like this, but she reminded herself that it was part of the job, part of the experience she needed to understand. Karen came over to help her clean up, offering a sympathetic smile. "Don't let him get to you. We've all had our moments," she whispered, carefully scooping up the broken glass. Isabella appreciated Karen's kindness, but she could tell that it wasn't just about the glass. Martin seemed to have a particular interest in making her life difficult, and she couldn't figure out why. She had tried to keep a low profile to blend in as best as she could, but it was clear that he was watching her more closely than the others. Maybe he was suspicious, or maybe he just enjoyed having someone new to pick on. The other staff had their own way of dealing with Martin's behavior. They spoke in hushed tones when he wasn't around, sharing stories about his outbursts and his impossible demands. Isabella learned that he had fired more than a few people over trivial mistakes, and that those who managed to stick around did so by staying out of his way. It was a toxic cycle, and she could see how it drained the energy from everyone who worked there. One night, after a particularly rough shift, Isabella sat alone in the staff room, nursing a bottle of water and trying to catch her breath. She was exhausted, but she didn't want to leave just yet. She needed to think, to figure out her next move. She knew she couldn't confront Martin directly, at least not yet. But she also knew she couldn't keep letting him treat people like this. As she sat there, lost in thought, Caleb walked in. He looked just as tired as she felt, but he smiled when he saw her. "Rough shift?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You could say that," Isabella replied, managing a small smile in return. "I'm still trying to get the hang of it." "You're doing fine," Caleb said reassuringly. "Better than most new hires. Trust me." Isabella appreciated his words, but she could tell that he was holding something back. "How do you do it?" she asked, almost without thinking. "How do you keep going day after day when it's like this?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much he should say. "I guess you just have to focus on the good parts," he said finally. "The little things, like when a customer smiles because you remembered their order, or when you help out a coworker who's having a rough day. It's not much, but it makes it easier to get through." Isabella nodded, understanding what he meant. She could see the kindness in him, the way he always tried to lift others up, even when he was struggling himself. It was one of the things that had stood out to her from the beginning. "And Martin?" she asked. "How do you deal with him?" Caleb's expression darkened slightly, and he looked away. "You don't, really. You just survive. He's got this place under his thumb, and everyone knows it. You push back too hard, and you're gone." The resignation in his voice hit Isabella harder than she expected. She had known things were bad, but hearing it from Caleb, seeing how it affected him, made it feel more real. "That doesn't seem right," she said softly. "People shouldn't have to be afraid of their boss." "No, they shouldn't," Caleb agreed. "But that's just how it is here. And unless someone's willing to do something about it, it's not going to change." Isabella felt a surge of determination. She wanted to tell Caleb that she was that someone, that she was here to make things right, but she knew it wasn't the time. She still had so much to learn, and she couldn't afford to reveal her true identity yet. But his words stayed with her, echoing in her mind as she finished her shift and headed home. The next day, she arrived at the restaurant early, determined to do better. She had made mistakes, but she wasn't going to let them define her. She worked harder, moved faster, and paid more attention to the details. And though Martin still found reasons to criticize her, she refused to let it get to her. She also started watching him more closely, trying to understand his patterns, his habits. She noticed how he always seemed to hover around the cash register, and how he would disappear into the office at odd times, often leaving the staff to fend for themselves during the busiest parts of the shift. It didn't make sense, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. One afternoon, she caught a glimpse of him slipping a small envelope into his pocket, looking around to make sure no one was watching. It was a small thing, but it made her even more suspicious. She needed to find out what he was up to, but she couldn't do it alone. She thought about what Caleb had said, about how people were too afraid to push back. She understood that fear, but she also knew that if she was going to change anything, she needed allies. And if she was going to earn their trust, she had to prove that she was on their side, even if they didn't know who she really was. As the day came to an end, Isabella made a decision. She wasn't just going to be a passive observer anymore. She was going to dig deeper, find out what Martin was hiding, and figure out a way to help the people who worked there. It was risky, but she was willing to take that risk. Because this wasn't just about saving a restaurant. It was about doing what was right. Over the next few days, Isabella continued her routine at the restaurant, quietly observing and trying to blend in. She was getting better at her tasks, but Martin's presence was still suffocating, and she could see how it affected everyone around her. Yet, amid the tension, there was one thing that made each shift a little more bearable: her growing friendship with Caleb. Caleb had a way of making even the toughest days seem less daunting. He was patient with the new hires, always willing to lend a hand or a kind word. Isabella found herself looking forward to the moments when they would work side by side, exchanging smiles and quick conversations between serving tables. There was something genuine about him, something that felt refreshingly different from the cold, rigid environment Martin had created. One afternoon, during a slower shift, Isabella got the chance to talk to Caleb more. They were both taking a quick break in the kitchen, leaning against the counter and sipping water. "So, Caleb," she said, trying to sound casual, "what's your story? How did you end up here?" Caleb shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not much of a story, really. Grew up around here, needed a job, and this place was hiring. It's not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills." "Do you like it?" Isabella asked, curious to see how he would respond. He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "I like the people," he said finally. "I mean, not Martin, obviously, but the rest of the crew. We kind of look out for each other, you know? That makes it worth sticking around." Isabella could see the loyalty in his eyes, the quiet determination to make the best of a bad situation. "That's admirable," she said softly. "It can't be easy, dealing with someone like Martin every day." "It's not," Caleb admitted, his smile fading slightly. "But I've learned to pick my battles. Some things are worth fighting for, and some, you just have to let go." There was a sadness in his voice that tugged at Isabella's heart. She wanted to know more, to understand what had happened to make him so resigned. But before she could ask, the door to the kitchen swung open, and Martin walked in, his eyes narrowing as he saw them talking. "Break's over," he barked, his voice sharp. "Get back to work, both of you." Caleb didn't even flinch. He simply nodded and set his cup down. "Yes, sir," he said, turning to head back to the dining area. Isabella followed, feeling a mix of frustration and determination building inside her. She was tired of seeing Martin treat people like they were nothing, and she was tired of feeling like she couldn't do anything about it. As the evening went on, the restaurant got busier, and Isabella found herself running from table to table, trying to keep up with the orders. She was getting better at managing the rush, but there were still moments when she felt overwhelmed. During one of those moments, Caleb appeared beside her, helping to carry a tray of drinks to a table. "Thanks," she said, a little breathless. "I don't know how you do this every day." "You get used to it," he replied with a grin. "Just keep moving and try not to think too much about how tired you are." They worked together for the next few minutes, moving in sync as they cleared tables and took new orders. For a little while, it felt almost easy, like they were a team. Isabella couldn't remember the last time she had felt this connected to someone, and she found herself smiling despite the chaos around them. When the rush finally died down, Caleb leaned against the counter, catching his breath. "You did good today, Emily," he said. "You're getting the hang of it." "Thanks," Isabella said, feeling a warm glow spread through her chest. "I had a good teacher." Caleb laughed. "Don't give me too much credit. You're the one doing all the hard work." Isabella hesitated for a moment, then decided to take a small risk. "Can I ask you something? It's kind of personal." Caleb raised an eyebrow, curious. "Sure, go ahead." "Why do you stay?" she asked. "I mean, I can tell you're good at what you do, and you obviously care about the people here. But with everything going on, why not just find another job?" Caleb's expression softened, and he seemed to be considering how much to share. "I've thought about it," he said slowly. but my mom's not doing too well. She's been sick for a while, and I need to be close by to help take care of her. This job, it's not perfect, but it's steady, and it lets me stay here for her." Isabella felt a pang of sympathy. She hadn't known that about him, and it made her admire him even more. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said gently. "I hope she gets better." "Thanks," Caleb said, giving her a small, grateful smile. "I appreciate that. It's just one of those things you have to deal with, you know? But I'm not giving up. She raised me on her own, and the least I can do is be there for her now." Isabella nodded, feeling a swell of admiration for him. Caleb was facing so many challenges, but he still found a way to stay strong, to keep going even when things were tough. She wished she could be that resilient. "You're a good son, Caleb," she said softly. "Your mom's lucky to have you." He looked a little embarrassed by the compliment, but she could see that it meant a lot to him. "Thanks, Emily. That means a lot." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a crash from the kitchen, followed by a string of angry curses. Martin's voice echoed through the restaurant, and everyone went silent, their eyes darting nervously toward the back. Isabella's heart sank as she realized what was happening. Martin was on another one of his rampages, and someone was about to be on the receiving end. "I'd better go see what that's about," Caleb said, his voice tense. "Stay out here, okay?" Isabella wanted to protest, to tell him that she could handle it, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Martin didn't listen to reason, and if she tried to intervene, she'd only make things worse. So she watched as Caleb disappeared into the kitchen, bracing herself for whatever was about to happen. She could hear Martin yelling, his voice getting louder and angrier by the second. Caleb's responses were calm and measured, but it was clear that Martin wasn't in the mood to listen. Isabella clenched her fists, fighting the urge to rush in there and do something. She hated feeling powerless, but she knew she had to be smart. She couldn't afford to get herself fired before she had a chance to fix things. When Caleb finally emerged from the kitchen, he looked shaken but unharmed. He gave Isabella a quick nod, as if to reassure her that everything was okay, but she could see the strain in his eyes. It was a reminder of just how toxic this place had become, and how much work she still had to do. As they finished the shift, Isabella made a silent promise to herself. She wasn't going to stand by and let Martin keep bullying people, and she wasn't going to let Caleb bear the brunt of it alone. She was going to find a way to change things, even if it meant taking risks. Because if Caleb could keep fighting, despite everything he was dealing with, then so could she. Isabella had always been observant. It was a skill that served her well as Emily. Over the next week, she continued to watch Martin closely, trying to piece together the puzzle of what was really going on in the restaurant. She still wasn't sure exactly what he was up to, but she had a feeling it was more than just a bad management style. The way he handled things seemed calculated, almost as if he was hiding something. One evening, after a particularly busy shift, Isabella was on her way to the storage room to grab more napkins when she overheard Martin speaking to one of the kitchen staff, a young man named Jerry. They were standing near the back exit, speaking in low, hurried tones, but she caught snippets of their conversation as she passed by. "You know what you need to do," Martin was saying, his voice tense. "I don't care how you handle it. Just make sure it doesn't get back to me. Understand?" Jerry looked nervous, glancing around as if he expected someone to be watching. I don't know, Martin. This doesn't feel right." Martin's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, towering over Jerry. "I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm telling you how it's going to be. Do your job, or you can find yourself another one." Isabella's heart raced as she ducked behind a shelf, careful not to make a sound. What was Martin pressuring Jerry into? Whatever it was clear that Martin wasn't above using threats to get what he wanted. She watched as Jerry nodded reluctantly, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had been placed on them, before turning and heading back into the kitchen. Martin lingered for a moment, glancing around suspiciously before finally walking away. Isabella waited until the coast was clear before emerging from her hiding spot. Her mind was buzzing with questions. She had known Martin was harsh, but this was the first time she had seen him actively threaten someone. She needed to find out more, but she also needed to be careful. If Martin suspected that she was onto him, he wouldn't hesitate to make her life difficult, or worse, get rid of her entirely. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant early, hoping to catch a moment alone with Jerry. She found him in the kitchen, preparing ingredients for the lunch rush. He looked tired, his eyes dark with worry, and Isabella could see the stress etched into his face. She hesitated for a moment before approaching him. "Hey, Jerry," she said, trying to sound casual. "Got a minute?" Jerry glanced up, looking startled to see her. "Oh, hey, Emily, what's up?" "I just wanted to see how you're doing," Isabella said, carefully choosing her words. "You seemed a little tense last night. Everything okay?" Jerry's eyes darted around nervously, as if he was afraid someone might overhear them. "I'm fine," he said quickly. "Just, work stuff." Isabella could tell he was lying, but she didn't want to push too hard and scare him off. "I get it," she said, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's not easy, working here, especially with Martin breathing down everyone's necks all the time." Jerry's expression softened a little, and she could see the hint of relief in his eyes. "Yeah, it's rough," he admitted. "But what can you do, right? Gotta pay the bills." Isabella nodded, pretending to focus on arranging the utensils nearby. "Still, it seems like Martin asks a lot from everyone, more than he should, sometimes." Jerry stiffened, and she knew she had struck a nerve. "Look, Emily," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I don't know what you think you heard, but it's better if you just stay out of it, okay? Trust me." His words only made Isabella more determined to dig deeper. Whatever was going on, it was clear that Martin was using his power to intimidate people, and she couldn't just ignore it. But she also realized that she needed to be careful. If Jerry was too scared to talk, it meant that Martin's control over the staff was stronger than she had thought. She spent the rest of the day trying to piece together what she had seen and heard, but it was difficult to focus. Her mind kept drifting back to Caleb and the conversation they had shared during their break a few days ago. He had mentioned that Martin had connections and that trying to stand up to him was risky. But what kind of connections? And how far did they reach? Later that evening, after the dinner rush had subsided, Isabella decided to take a different approach. She found Karen cleaning up near the bar and joined her, picking up a cloth to help wipe down the counters. "Karen, can I ask you something?" she said, keeping her voice casual. Karen looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Sure, what's on your mind?" "Has Martin always been like this?" Isabella asked, trying to sound curious but not too probing. "I mean, I know he's strict, but it feels like there's more to it." Karen sighed, setting down the cloth she was holding. "Martin's always been a bit of a hard ass, but it's gotten worse over the past year. It's like he's trying to prove something or cover something up, I don't know." "Cover something up," Isabella repeated, her interest piqued. "Like what?" Karen hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "There have been rumors," she said quietly. "People talk about money going missing, orders that don't add up, stuff like that. But no one's ever been able to prove anything. And the few who've tried to ask questions, well, let's just say they didn't stick around for long." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. This was worse than she had expected. It wasn't just about Martin being a bad manager. There was something illegal happening, and it was affecting more than just the employees. "Why hasn't anyone reported it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Karen shook her head. "To who?" "Martin's got the higher-ups wrapped around his finger. And besides, no one wants to risk losing their job. It's not exactly easy to find work around here, especially if you've got a family to support." Isabella could see the fear in Karen's eyes, the fear of speaking out, of losing everything. It made her even more determined to do something. But she also knew that she couldn't act on impulse. She needed solid proof, something that would force the higher-ups to take action. And she needed to be smart about how she got it. As she was getting ready to leave that night, Isabella noticed Martin slipping out of the office with the same small envelope she had seen him with before. This time, she made a point of following him, keeping her distance so he wouldn't notice. He walked through the restaurant, past the kitchen, and out the back door, heading towards the parking lot. Isabella waited a moment before slipping outside after him, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. She watched as he approached a car parked near the edge of the lot, where another man was waiting. Martin handed him the envelope, and the two exchanged a few quick words before the man got into his car and drove off. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but the exchange was enough to confirm her suspicions. Martin was hiding something, and whatever it was, it involved money, possibly a lot of it. Isabella's mind was racing as she made her way back inside. She needed to find out more, but she also needed to be careful. If Martin caught her snooping, it could blow everything. As she clocked out and headed home, she thought about what she had seen and how she could use it. She would have to be patient and she would have to be smart, but she was starting to see the bigger picture, and she knew she was getting closer to the truth. It was a dangerous game, but she wasn't backing down. Martin might have the power now, but she was determined to take it away from him, and she wasn't going to stop until she did. The restaurant felt different the next day. Isabella couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a palpable tension in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. She had spent most of the previous night thinking about what she had seen, the envelope, the secretive exchange in the parking lot, and trying to figure out her next move. But every time she thought she had a plan, she would remember how Martin had looked at Jerry, how he had spoken to him, and she would feel a shiver of doubt. She needed to get more information, but she couldn't afford to rush. If Martin suspected that she was onto him, it could all be over in an instant. For now, she had to keep up the act, keep blending in, and hope that no one noticed her watching. As she slipped into her uniform and got ready for her shift, she spotted Caleb at the back of the dining area, setting up tables. He caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring smile, and she felt a wave of comfort wash over her. Despite everything, there was something about Caleb that made her feel like things could be okay. He had a way of grounding her, of reminding her why she was doing this in the first place. "Hey, Emily," he said as she walked over. "Ready for another day of chaos?" "Bring it on," she replied with a grin, trying to keep her tone light. "I've survived this long, haven't I?" "Barely," he teased, but there was warmth in his voice. "But seriously, you're doing great. Better than most people who start here. Just don't let Martin get to you." Isabella nodded, appreciating his concern. "I'm trying. It's not easy, though." "No, it's not," Caleb said, his expression darkening slightly. "But you're stronger than you think. Just remember that." They worked side by side for most of the morning, and for a little while, it almost felt normal. Isabella was starting to get used to the rhythm of the restaurant, the ebb and flow of customers, the way the kitchen roared to life during the lunch rush and then settled into a steady hum. But even as she went through the motions, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That feeling only intensified when Martin walked in. He had been unusually quiet all morning, his usual barked orders replaced with a tense, clipped tone. He barely glanced at Isabella, which was unusual in itself, and she couldn't decide if that was a good thing or a bad thing. But she didn't have to wonder for long, because as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that something was going to happen. It started when one of the waitresses, a timid girl named Sophie, accidentally spilled a drink on a customer. It was a simple mistake, the kind that happened all the time in a busy restaurant, but Martin reacted as if it were the end of the world. He stormed over, his face twisted with fury, and started shouting at Sophie right in front of everyone. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snapped, his voice loud enough to make heads turn. "Can't you do anything right? This is the third time this week you've messed up. Do you want to lose your job? Because that's where this is heading." Sophie's eyes welled up with tears, and she stammered out an apology. But Martin wasn't listening. He kept going, his voice getting louder, harsher, until the entire restaurant was silent, watching the scene unfold. Isabella could see the fear in Sophie's eyes, and she felt her own anger rising. She wanted to do something, to say something, but she knew she couldn't afford to blow her cover. Not yet. It was Caleb who stepped in. He moved between Martin and Sophie, placing a hand on her shoulder and gently guiding her away. "It was just an accident, Martin," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She's already apologized. There's no need to make a scene." Martin turned on Caleb, his eyes narrowing. "And who the hell do you think you are, telling me how to run my restaurant?" he sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero, Bennett? Maybe you need a reminder of where you stand." Isabella's heart clenched as she watched Martin square off with Caleb, her mind racing. She knew Caleb was only trying to help, but she also knew how dangerous it was to stand up to Martin. She wanted to step in, to back him up, but she didn't know how to do it without risking everything. So she stayed silent, hoping that Caleb could handle it. "I'm just saying there's no need to be cruel," Caleb replied, his voice steady. "We're all doing our best here. That's all." Martin's face twisted with a smirk, and for a moment, Isabella thought he was going to let it go. But then he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, threatening whisper. "You think you're so noble, don't you, Bennett? Always trying to play the good guy. But let me make one thing clear. I can make your life a living hell if I want to. So unless you want to be out on the street by the end of the week, I suggest you keep your mouth shut and do your damn job." Caleb didn't flinch, but Isabella could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Understood, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The confrontation ended as quickly as it had started, but the damage was done. Martin stalked off, leaving a trail of silence in his wake, and Caleb stood there, looking shaken but defiant. Isabella wanted to run to him, to tell him that he wasn't alone, but she knew it wasn't the time. Not yet. Instead, she went back to work, her mind buzzing with a new sense of urgency. When her shift ended, she found Caleb sitting outside on the back steps, staring out at the parking lot. He didn't look up when she approached, but he didn't tell her to go away either. She sat down beside him, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly, finally breaking the silence. "It was brave, but dangerous." Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said. "But I couldn't just stand there and let him do that to Sophie. She didn't deserve it." "No one does," Isabella agreed. "But standing up to him like that, it's going to make things harder for you." "Maybe," Caleb said, turning to look at her. "But sometimes, you have to do what's right, even if it costs you. That's what my mom always used to say." Isabella's heart ached at his words. She wanted to tell him everything, to let him know that she was there to fight this battle with him. But she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're a good person, Caleb," she said quietly, "and you're not alone in this." He looked at her, surprised, but he didn't pull his hand away. "Thanks, Emily," he said, his voice soft. "That means a lot." They sat there for a while, neither of them saying much, but the silence was comfortable, almost peaceful. For the first time since she had started this whole charade, Isabella felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She still had a long way to go, and there were still so many things she didn't understand, but she was starting to see the path forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Isabella made a decision. She wasn't going to wait any longer. Martin had to be stopped, and she was going to do whatever it took to make that happen. It wasn't just about exposing him. It was about protecting people like Caleb, like Sophie, who deserved so much better than this. She didn't know how it would end or what she would have to sacrifice along the way, but she was ready to find out. Because if there was one thing she had learned from Caleb, it was that sometimes doing what was right was worth the risk. The more time Isabella spent at the restaurant, the more she realized just how deep the problems ran. Every shift seemed to bring a new layer of tension, a new set of whispered conversations that ended abruptly when Martin walked by. But there was also something else, a growing sense of camaraderie among the staff, a quiet defiance that seemed to take root whenever they thought no one was watching. It gave her hope, even as the situation grew more complicated. Her friendship with Caleb had become one of the few bright spots in her day. He was kind, patient, and always seemed to know when someone needed a word of encouragement or a quick joke to lighten the mood. Isabella found herself looking for reasons to be near him, to share a few minutes of conversation between orders, and she could tell he felt the same. But as much as she wanted to get closer to him, she knew she had to be careful. She was still hiding a part of herself, and every day she spent as Emily only made the lie more difficult to maintain. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Isabella found herself walking alongside Caleb as they left the restaurant. The night was cool, the air filled with the distant sounds of traffic and the occasional chirp of crickets. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their steps matching each other's, until Caleb spoke up. "I don't usually do this," he said, glancing at her with a small, nervous smile. "But would you want to grab a coffee? There's this place down the street that stays open late and well, I figured we could both use a break." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to ask, but the idea of spending more time with him, away from the restaurant, was too tempting to pass up. "I'd like that," she said, trying to keep her excitement in check. "Lead the way." The coffee shop was small and cozy, with dim lighting and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. They found a table near the window, and for a little while it felt like they were just two normal people, unwinding after a long day. No uniforms, no demanding customers, no Martin, just them. As they sipped their drinks, Caleb started to open up in a way he hadn't before. He talked about his mother, about how she had been diagnosed with a chronic illness a few years ago, and how he had been trying to balance work and taking care of her ever since. Isabella listened quietly, her heart aching for him. She could hear the love in his voice, the way he spoke about her, and she admired how much he had sacrificed to make sure she was okay. "It's tough," he admitted, staring down at his cup. "But I don't mind. She's done so much for me, and this is just my way of giving back. I just wish I could do more." "You're already doing so much, Caleb," Isabella said softly. "More than most people would. You should be proud of that." Caleb looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, Emily. That means a lot, coming from you." For a moment, Isabella wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to explain why she was really there, why she was hiding behind a fake name, and how much it hurt to see him struggling when she had the power to help. But she couldn't. Not yet. She was too deep into her disguise, and she didn't know how he would react if he found out she'd been lying to him all this time. Instead, she decided to ask him something that had been on her mind for a while. "Caleb, why do you think Martin is so harsh? I mean, I get that he's in charge, but it feels like there's more to it, like he's trying to keep people scared." Caleb's expression darkened, and he hesitated before answering. "I don't know everything, but I've heard things. People talk, and there are rumors about money going missing, about deals that don't make sense. Martin's got connections, and he's not afraid to use them. It's like he thinks he can do whatever he wants, and no one can stop him." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. This was exactly what she had suspected, but hearing it confirmed from Caleb made it feel more real, more urgent. "But if people know he's doing something wrong, why hasn't anyone reported it?" "Because they're scared," Caleb said, his voice low. "Martin's made sure of that. He's got friends in high places, and anyone who tries to speak out usually finds themselves out of a job. Or worse, it's not just about losing work, it's about losing everything." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Isabella could see the fear in Caleb's eyes, the kind of fear that came from living under someone's thumb for too long. It made her even more determined to do something, to find a way to break Martin's hold over the restaurant and the people who worked there. But she still didn't know how. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, until Caleb spoke again. "You know, you're different from most people who start working at the restaurant," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You actually care. It's refreshing." Isabella's heart twisted at his words. She wanted to tell him that she cared because this was her family's business, because she had a responsibility to make things right, but she still couldn't bring herself to say it. "I care because it's the right thing to do," she said instead, "and because people like you deserve better." Caleb's smile widened, and for a moment, she could see a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Well, I'm glad you're here, Emily. Things have been pretty dark lately, but it's nice to have someone who makes it a little brighter." Isabella felt a warmth spread through her chest, and she smiled back at him. "I'm glad I'm here too," she said softly, "more than you know." As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Isabella made a decision. She needed to find out exactly what Martin was up to, and she needed to do it soon. She didn't have all the pieces yet, but she was starting to see a clearer picture, and she knew that if she could gather enough evidence, she might be able to expose him. But she couldn't do it alone. Before they parted ways that night, Isabella turned to Caleb, her heart pounding in her chest. "Caleb, I know this is a lot to ask, but if you hear anything, if you see anything suspicious, will you let me know? I want to help, but I can't do it unless I know what's really going on." Caleb looked at her, surprised, but there was no hesitation in his answer. "Of course, Emily. I'll do whatever I can to help." She nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't let you down." As she watched him walk away, disappearing into the night, Isabella felt a mix of fear and determination. She was getting closer to the truth, but she knew that every step she took was bringing her closer to a confrontation with Martin. And when that moment came, she would need to be ready. But for now, she had something she hadn't had before, an ally. And as long as she had Caleb by her side, she knew she could face whatever was coming. The atmosphere at the restaurant had shifted, though not in a way that would be obvious to most customers. To the regulars, it was business as usual, servers rushing around, the kitchen clanging with activity, and Martin pacing with his usual scowl. But for the staff, particularly those who had been there long enough to know better, something felt different. There was an undercurrent of anxiety, a tension that simmered just below the surface, and Isabella could sense that it was about to boil over. For the past week, she had been quietly gathering information, piecing together bits of conversations, and paying close attention to Martin's movements. She had noticed how he would disappear into the office for long stretches of time, only to re-emerge with a hardened expression, his mood even worse than before. She had caught glimpses of documents, hastily shoved into drawers or hidden under stacks of invoices, and she was sure now more than ever that Martin was up to something big, something illegal. Her suspicions were confirmed one afternoon when she overheard Martin having a heated conversation on the phone in the back office. She couldn't make out every word, but what she did hear was enough to send a chill down her spine. "I don't care how you do it," Martin was saying, his voice low and menacing. "Just make sure those numbers don't trace back to me. If anyone finds out about this, we're all screwed." Isabella's heart raced as she pressed herself against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. She knew she was taking a risk by eavesdropping, but she couldn't afford to miss this. Martin was confirming everything she had suspected. There was money being diverted, and he was desperate to cover his tracks. When the call ended, she heard Martin curse under his breath and the sound of papers being shuffled. Isabella took a deep breath and stepped away from the wall, trying to act as if she hadn't just been listening in. She needed to get to the bottom of this, and she needed proof. But she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep playing the part of Emily without raising Martin's suspicions. That night, as the staff was cleaning up after the dinner rush, Martin called a sudden meeting. It was unusual for him to address everyone like this, and Isabella could see the confusion on the faces of her coworkers. Caleb stood next to her, his brow furrowed, and she felt a pang of nervousness. Whatever Martin was about to say, it wasn't going to be good. "Listen up, everyone," Martin said, his tone cold and authoritative. "I've been getting complaints about performance lately, and I'm not happy with what I've been seeing. If you can't keep up, then maybe this isn't the right job for you. Consider this your warning." There was a murmur of unease among the staff, and Isabella clenched her fists, struggling to keep her composure. Martin's words were designed to intimidate, to remind everyone that their jobs could be taken away at any moment. But she wasn't going to let him keep scaring people into silence. Not anymore. As the meeting broke up, she caught Caleb's eye and gave him a slight nod, silently asking him to meet her outside after they finished. He looked hesitant, but he nodded back, and she felt a flicker of hope. She had been gathering information on her own, but she needed someone she could trust. Someone who could back her up if things went wrong. When the last of the customers had left and the restaurant was finally quiet, Isabella slipped out the back door, finding Caleb already waiting for her. The night was cool, a light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees lining the parking lot. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "Emily," Caleb said finally, his voice low. "What's going on? You've been acting different lately. And I know you're worried about Martin, but whatever you're planning, you need to be careful. He's dangerous." Isabella took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, but also the one she knew had to happen. "Caleb, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." He frowned, concern etched across his features. "What is it?" "I'm not just a waitress," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "My real name isn't Emily. It's Isabella Hargrove." Caleb blinked, his confusion deepening. "Hargrove? As in, the Hargrove Enterprises?" "Yes," Isabella said, her heart pounding. "I own this restaurant. Well, not just this one, all of them. I've been running the company since my father passed away. And I came here because I wanted to see what was really going on. I heard rumors, complaints, but I didn't want to believe them. So I decided to find out for myself." For a moment, Caleb just stared at her, as if trying to process what she had just said. Isabella braced herself, expecting anger, betrayal, disbelief. But when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "So, you've been undercover this whole time?" "Yes," she said, relief washing over her. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I wanted to, but I needed to make sure I understood everything before I took action. And now, I do. Martin is stealing from the company, and he's using fear to keep everyone from speaking up. I have proof, but I need your help to confront him." Caleb was silent for a moment, and then he laughed, a soft, incredulous sound. "I can't believe this. I mean, I knew you were different, but wow." He shook his head, a smile spreading across his face. "I'm not mad, if that's what you're worried about. If anything, I'm impressed." Isabella felt a surge of gratitude and affection. "You are?" "Yeah," he said, his smile fading slightly. "But you're taking a huge risk. Martin's not going to back down without a fight. Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I have to be," she said, her voice firm. "This is my family's legacy, and I'm not going to let him destroy it. But I can't do it alone. Will you stand by me?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "Of course I will," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a steady resolve. "Whatever you need, I'm here." The next day, Isabella arrived at the restaurant with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent the night preparing, gathering all the evidence she had collected, and she was ready to make her move. As the lunch rush came and went, she kept a close eye on Martin, waiting for the right moment. It came in the early afternoon, when the restaurant was quiet and most of the staff were busy cleaning up. Isabella approached Martin in the office, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Martin, we need to talk." He looked up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "What is it, Emily? I'm busy." "No," she said, stepping closer. "I'm not Emily. My name is Isabella Hargrove, and I'm the owner of this restaurant, and I know what you've been doing." For a moment, there was complete silence. Martin's face went pale, and she could see the shock, the fear flickering across his eyes as he realized who she was. But then he recovered, his expression hardening. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice cold. "But if you think you can walk in here and start making accusations—" "I have proof," Isabella interrupted, pulling out the documents she had copied, the records of transactions that didn't add up, the receipts that pointed to money being funneled out of the business. "You've been stealing from this company, and you've been using fear to keep everyone quiet, but it ends today." Martin's eyes darted to the door, as if considering his options. "You can't prove any of this," he said, but his voice wavered. "You're bluffing." "I'm not," she said, taking a step closer. "And I've already contacted the authorities. They'll be here soon to go through everything, and if you have any sense at all, you'll cooperate." There was a moment where she thought he might lash out, might try to deny it or even threaten her. But then, slowly, the fight seemed to drain out of him. He looked down at the papers, his shoulders slumping, and she knew she had won. When the police arrived, Martin didn't resist. He was led out of the restaurant in handcuffs, his head bowed, and Isabella watched as the staff slowly began to realize what had happened. There was a stunned silence, followed by a ripple of relief, of murmured conversations as the tension that had gripped the place for so long finally began to lift. Isabella felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Caleb standing beside her, his expression filled with pride. "You did it," he said, his voice soft. "You actually did it." "No," she said, smiling at him. "We did it." The restaurant had never felt so quiet. Even after the commotion of Martin being let out in handcuffs, there was a stillness that hung in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath, trying to process what had just happened. Isabella stood at the front of the restaurant, watching as the police cars pulled away, their flashing lights disappearing into the distance. For a moment, she felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting off her shoulders. But she knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much more to uncover. She had expected there to be questions, confusion, maybe even anger. But as she turned to face the staff, she was met with a mixture of shock and tentative hope. They had seen Martin get taken away, and now they were all looking at her, waiting for an explanation. She had to tell them the truth. All of it. "Everyone, can I have your attention, please?" Isabella said, raising her voice so that it carried across the room. Slowly, the chatter died down, and all eyes turned to her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I know today has been unexpected, to say the least. There's something I need to share with all of you." She paused, searching for the right words. "My name is not Emily. My real name is Isabella Hargrove. I am the owner of Hargrove Enterprises, and this restaurant, along with many others, belongs to my family's company. I've been working here undercover because I wanted to see for myself what was really happening." There was a murmur of surprise, a few gasps, and then a stunned silence. Isabella could see the shock on their faces, the way some of them exchanged confused glances, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. She continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know this might be hard to understand, but I didn't feel like I could truly fix the problems unless I saw them with my own eyes. I had heard complaints about management, about how things were being run, but I didn't realize just how bad it was until I experienced it myself." Karen, who had been standing near the back, stepped forward, her eyes wide. "So, everything you've been doing, It was all a setup. To spy on us? Isabella shook her head. No, it wasn't like that. I wasn't here to spy on you. I was here to help. I needed to understand what was going wrong, and I didn't want anyone to treat me differently because of who I am. I know it might not make sense, but I did this because I care about this place. About all of you. There was another pause, and then, to her surprise, someone began to clap. It was Caleb, standing off to the side, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. The sound echoed through the room, and one by one, others joined in, their hesitant claps growing louder until the entire restaurant was filled with applause. Isabella felt her heart swell, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over her. When the clapping finally subsided, Caleb stepped forward, giving her a small, reassuring smile. I think what Isabella is trying to say is that she's not just here to expose the bad, she's here to make things right. And after what we saw today, I believe her. Isabella nodded, grateful for his support. That's exactly it. What happened with Martin was just the beginning. I've uncovered evidence that shows there's a much bigger issue, involving not just this restaurant but several others across the company. Martin was part of a network of managers who have been stealing money and mistreating staff. It's been going on for years, and I'm going to do everything I can to put an end to it. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Isabella could see the mix of emotions on their faces: relief, anger, confusion. Some of them looked hopeful, while others seemed wary, unsure of what to believe. She couldn't blame them. They had been through so much, and trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. I know this isn't going to be easy, she continued, her voice strong. There are still a lot of questions that need to be answered, and there are people who need to be held accountable. But I promise you this, things are going to change. From now on, this place, all of our restaurants, will be run the way my father intended. With integrity, respect, and care for every single person who walks through those doors, whether they're a customer or a member of our staff. There was a long silence, and then someone from the back of the room called out, "But how can we be sure? How do we know things won't just go back to the way they were?" It was a fair question, and Isabella didn't have an easy answer. But she knew she couldn't make empty promises. I understand why you're hesitant, and I don't expect you to trust me just because of what I've said today. Trust has to be earned, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn yours. I'm not going to disappear after this. I'm going to be here, working with all of you, to make sure things really do get better. And if you see something that isn't right, I want you to tell me. No one should ever feel afraid to speak up. Slowly, the mood in the room began to shift. Isabella could see some of the tension melting away, replaced by cautious optimism. Karen, who had been one of the most vocal skeptics, stepped forward again, this time with a tentative smile. "Well, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm willing to give you a chance," she said. "If you're serious about making things better, then I'm in." One by one, others began to nod, their expressions softening as they looked at Isabella. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start, and that was all she needed. After the meeting, Caleb found her in the hallway, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "That was impressive," he said. "But you know this isn't over, right? If Martin was part of a bigger scheme, there are probably others out there who won't be happy about what you've done." "I know," Isabella said, her voice calm, "and I'm ready for them. I've already started an internal investigation, and I'm going to keep digging until I find every last person involved. They can try to stop me, but I'm not backing down." Caleb's eyes softened, and he took a step closer, his voice low. "I meant what I said earlier. I'm with you, no matter what. Just be careful, okay? You've already done so much, but I don't want to see you get hurt." Isabella's heart fluttered at his words, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, Caleb," she said softly. "I don't think I could have done this without you." He smiled, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. But the moment was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing, and Isabella's expression grew serious as she recognized the number. It was the head of her legal team, calling with updates on the investigation. She answered, her voice professional and composed, but her mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened. "Yes, this is Isabella. What's the latest?" The conversation was brief, but it confirmed what she had suspected. Martin's actions weren't isolated. There were other managers involved, and they had been coordinating to divert funds across multiple locations. It was a complex web of deceit, and unraveling it was going to take time. As she hung up, she turned to Caleb, her eyes steely with determination. "This isn't over," she said. "Not by a long shot, but I'm going to see it through, no matter what." Caleb nodded, his expression matching hers. "Then so am I." Isabella felt a surge of confidence, bolstered by his support. She knew there were still challenges ahead, and that taking down the rest of the corrupt network wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control, like she had the power to make things right. As she walked out of the restaurant that evening, the sky was dark but clear, the stars shining brightly above. She took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs, and allowed herself a small smile. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning she was proud of. And with Caleb by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and late nights spent poring over documents. Isabella threw herself into the investigation, determined to uncover every detail of the corruption that had been festering within her company. She had thought that exposing Martin would be the hardest part, but as she began to unravel the network of deceit, she realized just how deep it went. It was like peeling back layers of a rotten onion, each new discovery revealing yet another hidden problem. But she wasn't alone. True to his word, Caleb was by her side every step of the way. Whenever Isabella felt overwhelmed, whenever the scale of what she was trying to accomplish threatened to crush her, he was there to remind her why she was doing it. His quiet strength, his unwavering belief in her, kept her grounded, and she found herself relying on him more than she had ever expected. "I'm starting to think you're addicted to paperwork," Caleb teased one night as they sat in the office, surrounded by stacks of documents. It was well past closing time, and the restaurant was quiet. The only sound the occasional rustle of papers and the hum of the air conditioning. Isabella looked up from the report she was reading, a tired smile on her face. "If I never see another spreadsheet again, it'll be too soon," she said, stretching her arms over her head. "But we're getting closer. I can feel it." Caleb's smile faded slightly, and he leaned forward, his expression serious. "Do you think they'll try to stop you? I mean, if there are more people involved, they're not just going to sit back and let you take them down." Isabella's gaze hardened. "They can try," she said. "But I'm not stopping until every single one of them is held accountable. This company is my father's legacy, and I'm not going to let anyone destroy it." Caleb reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I know you'll do it," he said softly. "You've already come this far, but just promise me you'll be careful, okay? I don't want anything to happen to you." She felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, and she squeezed his hand back. "I promise," she said, "and thank you for everything." Over the next few days, they continued to dig deeper, and Isabella began to piece together the full extent of the scheme. It wasn't just about skimming money off the top. There were falsified invoices, fake suppliers, and even kickbacks being paid out to ensure that certain people kept quiet. It was a carefully orchestrated operation, and it had been going on for years, right under her nose. As the evidence piled up, Isabella knew she needed to act quickly. She couldn't afford to let anyone slip away, and she couldn't risk the people involved trying to cover their tracks. She reached out to her legal team, instructing them to prepare a case, and began drafting a plan to confront the other managers involved. But she also knew that she needed to do this in person. It wasn't enough to send a team of lawyers. She needed to show them that she was serious, that she wasn't afraid. The showdown was set for a Thursday afternoon. Isabella had arranged for a meeting with the managers from several different locations, using the pretense of a routine business review. She had chosen a neutral location, a conference room at a nearby hotel, to ensure that no one would be able to slip away unnoticed. Caleb insisted on coming with her, and though she worried about putting him in the middle of it, she was grateful for his support. As they arrived at the hotel, Isabella could feel her nerves beginning to fray. She had faced many challenges over the past few weeks, but this felt different. This was it, the moment she had been building toward, the moment when she would finally confront the people who had been undermining her company from within. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and glanced over at Caleb, who gave her a reassuring nod. "You've got this," he said, his voice calm and steady, "and I'll be right there with you." Isabella nodded, mustering a small smile. "Let's do this." The conference room was already half full when they arrived. Isabella recognized some of the faces, men and women who had been running various branches of the business for years. They greeted her politely, clearly unaware of what was about to happen, and she forced herself to return their smiles, even as her stomach churned with anxiety. Once everyone had taken their seats, Isabella stepped to the front of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see Caleb standing off to the side, his presence a steadying force, and she took strength from it. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clear and confident. "I know this was called on short notice, but there are some important matters we need to address." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the room, watching the expressions on their faces. Some of them looked confused, others curious, but no one seemed particularly concerned. That would change soon enough. "For the past several weeks, I've been conducting an internal investigation into irregularities within the company," she continued. "What I've discovered is that there has been a coordinated effort to siphon money from multiple locations, involving falsified invoices, fake suppliers, and illegal kickbacks, and I have proof that several people in this room have been participating in these activities." There was a murmur of shock, and Isabella could see the sudden shift in their expressions, confusion giving way to fear, to panic. One of the managers, a man named Harris, stood up, his face pale. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what you're talking about." Isabella didn't flinch. "I'm talking about you, Harris," she said, pulling out a file and setting it down on the table. "These are records of payments made to a fake supplier that you set up, along with emails that link you directly to the transactions. And you're not the only one. I have similar evidence against several others in this room." Harris's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Isabella could feel the eyes of everyone on her, but she didn't back down. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let this moment slip away. "I understand that some of you may have felt pressured, that you may have been drawn into this without fully understanding what you were getting into," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But that doesn't excuse what's been done. This company was built on trust, on integrity, and I will not allow anyone to destroy that. Effective immediately, those who are found to have participated in illegal activities will be removed from their positions, and legal action will be pursued." There was a stunned silence, followed by a flurry of whispers. Isabella could see the fear on their faces, the realization that they were caught, and she felt a pang of satisfaction. For too long, these people had been allowed to operate in the shadows, thinking they could get away with it, but not anymore. As she finished speaking, Caleb stepped forward, his presence commanding the room's attention. "You heard Isabella," he said, his voice firm. "This is a new beginning for Hargrove Enterprises. And if any of you have information that could help with the investigation, now is the time to come forward. Because this isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about rebuilding trust." Slowly, hesitantly, a few hands went up. Isabella felt a surge of relief. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but this was a start. They were finally beginning to break through the wall of silence, to shine a light on everything that had been hidden for so long. As the meeting ended, Isabella stepped outside, the cool breeze a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the conference room. Caleb joined her, his expression one of quiet pride. "You did it," he said. "I knew you would." "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, turning to face him. "Really, Caleb, I mean that." For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of everything that had happened settling over them. And then, without thinking, Isabella stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight hug. Caleb stiffened in surprise, but then he relaxed, his arms coming up to hold her close. "I'm proud of you," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "You're stronger than you know." Isabella pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at him, her heart full. "And you're more than I deserve," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Caleb, for everything." He smiled, and for a moment, it felt like the world had faded away, leaving just the two of them, standing together under the fading light of the afternoon. It wasn't over yet. There were still battles to be fought, still challenges to face. But for the first time, Isabella felt like they could win. The weeks following the confrontation were a blur of activity, but for the first time in a long time, the energy around Hargrove Enterprises felt hopeful. Isabella had kept her promise. The investigation had led to the arrest of several more managers who had been involved in the corruption, and the company was beginning to cleanse itself of the rot that had been hidden within. It was a slow process, but every step forward felt like a small victory. With Martin and the others out of the picture, Isabella set to work on restructuring the management of each restaurant, starting with the one in Charleston where her journey had begun. She held meetings with the staff, listening to their concerns, their suggestions, and most importantly, their stories. She wanted them to understand that things were going to be different, that they were going to be treated with respect and dignity, just as her father had always intended. One afternoon, as she stood in the main dining area of the Charleston restaurant, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The place felt different now, lighter, warmer. There were still busy shifts, still moments of chaos, but there was also laughter, and the kind of camaraderie that had been missing for so long. She saw Karen smiling as she served a table, Sophie chatting with a customer, and even Jerry, who had been so nervous under Martin's rule, was moving with a newfound confidence. But it wasn't just the restaurant that had changed. Isabella had changed too. She had come here pretending to be someone else, hoping to uncover the truth, but she had found more than she had expected. She had found herself, and she had found Caleb. Caleb had been with her through it all, helping her pick up the pieces, offering his strength when hers wavered. Their bond had grown deeper, and though they had never explicitly talked about what was happening between them, there was an unspoken understanding. They had started as friends, but they were something more now, something stronger. As Isabella finished a meeting with the new manager she had appointed, she stepped outside, needing a moment to clear her head. The sun was shining, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves on the trees, and she took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. It was a beautiful day, and for once, she felt like she could actually enjoy it. "Hey, stranger." She turned to see Caleb walking toward her, a grin on his face. He had just finished his shift, and there was a hint of mischief in his eyes, the kind that always made her heart skip a beat. "Got a minute?" he asked, stopping in front of her. "For you? Always," she said, smiling back. He nodded, looking thoughtful for a moment, as if he was trying to figure out how to say something. "I was thinking, we've been through a lot together lately. More than most people go through in a lifetime." Isabella nodded, her smile softening. "We have..." "And I was also thinking, maybe it's time we stopped pretending like there isn't something between us," he said, his voice gentle but confident. "Because, I don't know about you, but I'm tired of pretending." Isabella's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt almost surreal. "I'm tired of pretending, too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been for a long time. Caleb's grin widened, and he took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers. Then how about we do something about it? He said, his voice low, warm. No more secrets, no more hiding, just us. She didn't hesitate. She reached up and pulled him into a kiss, her hands resting on his shoulders, feeling the warmth of his skin through his shirt. For a moment, everything else melted away. The stress, the challenges, the fear. There was just him and her, and the promise of something new. When they finally broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his smile soft, almost shy. I've been wanting to do that for a while, he said, his breath mingling with hers. Me too, Isabella said, her heart swelling with happiness. I'm glad we finally did. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, wandering around the city, laughing, talking, and just enjoying each other's company. It felt like the beginning of something, a new chapter in their lives, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't dominated by work and stress. A future where she could be happy, with Caleb by her side. A few weeks later, the transformation of the restaurant was complete. Isabella had taken the time to make sure everything was in place. New management, better pay for the staff, and a focus on creating a healthy, supportive work environment. She wanted this place, and every other restaurant in the chain, to be a reflection of her father's values, and she was determined to see it through. As a thank you to the staff, she organized a celebration at the restaurant, inviting everyone who had worked there, past and present, as well as a few of the other managers who had helped her during the investigation. It was a chance to mark a new beginning, to show that things were truly changing. The evening was filled with laughter, music, and good food. Isabella moved through the crowd, talking to people, catching up with old friends, and making new ones. She could feel the joy in the air, the sense of relief that things were finally looking up, and it made her heart swell with pride. This was what she had been fighting for, this sense of community, of belonging. Toward the end of the night, Caleb found her standing near the entrance, watching as the staff danced and laughed together. He slipped his hand into hers, and she smiled up at him, grateful for his presence. Looks like the party's a success, he said, his eyes twinkling. It is, she said, squeezing his hand, but I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my rock through all of this. And I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice serious. I'm with you, Isabella. Wherever this leads, I'm right there beside you. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were happy tears. I love you, Caleb, she said, the words coming out without hesitation. I think I've loved you from the moment we met. Caleb's smile was wide, genuine, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. I love you too, he whispered, and I can't wait to see what we build together. The celebration ended with a toast. Isabella stood at the center of the room, a glass of champagne in hand, as the staff gathered around her. She looked out at the faces of the people who had become more than just employees. They were her team, her friends, her family. I just want to say thank you, she began, her voice carrying across the room. Thank you for believing in me, and thank you for standing by me, even when things were tough. This place wouldn't be what it is without each and every one of you, and I am so proud of everything we've accomplished together. This is just the beginning, and I can't wait to see where we go from here. The room erupted into cheers, and as Isabella raised her glass, she felt a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't felt in a long time. This was what her father had wanted, a place where people could come together, support each other, and build something meaningful. And now, she was the one carrying that vision forward. The night ended with her and Caleb standing outside the restaurant, watching as the last of the guests left, the city lights twinkling in the distance. So, Caleb said, slipping his arm around her waist, what's next for the great Isabella Hargrove? She leaned into him, a contented smile on her face. I don't know, she said, but whatever it is, I'm ready for it. As long as you're with me. Always, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple, always. And with that, they walked off into the night, ready to face whatever the future held, hand in hand.